Okay, I think we should begin. I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar. And as you can see, the title is Understanding the Mechanisms of Psychotherapy Action, Insights from Affective Neuroscience. And I would like to briefly present our speaker today, Irene Messina from Italy. She's a psychotherapist and a researcher and associate professor of dynamic psychology at the Universitas Mercatorum in Rome. And she also collaborates with the Department of Psychology at University of Trento. One of her main research interests is the integration of clinical knowledge with effective neuroscience and the application now of neuroimaging technologies to the investigation of emotional regulation, psychopathology, and psychotherapy. She's a very active member of SPR in the Italian group, and she is also a country coordinator for Italy. So welcome, Irene, and thank you so much for agreeing to present this webinar, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me and see me? Everything is working. Okay, perfect. So thank you, Miguel, for inviting me today. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk about my research. Starting from my PhD starting from 2010, the integration between affective neuroscience and psychotherapy research is the core of my research activity and interest. So I am very happy today to have the opportunity to talk with you about this topic. So just to start, this is just to give you an idea about the development of this field of research. These are the results of a brief research in Google Scholar using the words affective neuroscience and psychotherapy, or neuroimaging and psychotherapy. So as you can see, there has been a big development in the last years, and especially in the last 20 years. Several reasons can explain this development. First of all, the availability of new technologies. In the early studies that used neuroimaging to study psychotherapy, the researchers have used mostly PET technologies, or more simple technologies that can give an idea of the brain metabolisms, but are not specific for the investigation of specific tasks or a specific concept. Instead, more recently with the fMRI, it's possible to investigate very specific functions of the brain, because individuals can be exposed to stimuli or can be invited to carry out tasks, and we can observe the neural correlates of a variety of functions. So this is very important to study psychotherapy, or more in general clinical phenomena. Similar than in the general psychotherapy research, also in the field of neuroscience, early studies were focused on very simple disorders and simple therapies, let's say. For example, the early studies are focused on arachnophobia treated with exposure therapy. But now we have also studies on personality disorders, long-term therapies. So now we have more research also on more complex topics, even if also in general in psychotherapy research, brief therapies and simple disorders without comorbidities are more studied and more investigated because it's easier. But now we have also more complex studies. Then in early studies, researchers have used very standard design because they were inspired by traditional neuroimaging studies. So for example, early studies used working memory tasks or just exposure to standardized stimuli. But now we also have more complex studies that are more ecological, that use personalized design, for example, personalized narratives of the patients. So it's a very growing field of investigation. But most interesting, the early studies the aim of the early studies was just to demonstrate that psychotherapy can change the brain. So if we read the older papers, we read in the discussion that yes, psychotherapy can change the brain, and we have evidence at the brain level that psychotherapy has an effect. But now this is very simple. Now we also need to understand how the brain changes, because observing the change at the brain level, we are able also to make hypotheses about the therapeutic change more in general. So we can understand how psychotherapy works, also observing the brain. But this is a very important issue because we need to understand and to interpret the data that we observe in the brain. So we observe that there are changes, but the theoretical models that we have to understand, to explain this data needs to be improved. Most of the papers about the neuroimaging of psychotherapy use the concept of emotion regulation. So the theories of emotion regulation are the most used theories that the researchers use to interpret neuroimaging data. Emotion regulation can be defined as a set of processes that the individual may use to change their emotional reactivity. This is a traditional definition of emotion regulation. As you can see here in the picture, is a very simple model. The idea is that we can be activated, emotionally activated by stressful events in our everyday life, but we can use techniques or strategies in order to decrease our emotional activation. And this kind of model is very easy, and I am sure that many psychotherapists, some of you in this moment are thinking that is very simple as model. But this very simple model has been used in general to explain all the affective disorders in neuroimaging and also psychotherapy. So when we read a paper on psychopathology or psychotherapy that have used that has used neuroimaging techniques, usually they interpret the result using this concept of emotion regulation. So the idea, this is an example of a dual process model. The idea is that we have two categories of processes. On one hand, we have automatic processes that are bottom-up, so they are based on the automatic form of attention, and they are carried out without a voluntary action of the individual. And in the case of emotions, the idea is that the limbic system and the amygdala are involved in automatic processes. So if we have a stressful event in our life, our amygdala is activated and we feel an emotion. On the other hand, we also have controlled processes that depend on other forms of attention. They are voluntary and they start from the individual. So the individual carry out in a deliberate way a task or an action. And the idea is that emotion regulation is a form of top-down voluntary process. So on one hand, we have automatic emotional reaction, and on the other hand, we have the possibility to voluntarily decrease this emotional reaction using cognitive strategies. This is the summary of this popular model. And this model has also, there are many evidence that account for this kind of model. And this model is based mostly on studies that have investigated reappraisal, which is the most investigated emotional regulation strategy. And in such kind of studies, individuals are exposed to emotional stimuli, and they are instructed to decrease their emotional activation in response of such emotional stimuli. And the use of such strategies has been found to involve areas such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, in this dorsal part, and to decrease the activation in the amygdala. So this confirms this dual process model. When we use emotional regulation strategies, we activate executive areas of the brain, so the areas that the areas involved in executive processes, in cognitive effortful tasks, and we decrease emotional areas such as the amygdala. This kind of model has been applied also to the explanation of psychotherapy action. So the idea is that when individuals are exposed to psychotherapy, they increase their ability to regulate emotion, and this should correspond to increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, in prefrontal areas, and decreased activity of the amygdala. So when after psychotherapy, we are more able to decrease our emotional activation using cognitive strategies, and so using executive functions. This is a very simple model that has been applied very largely in affective neuroscience. This is used to explain most forms of psychopathology, is used to explain the action of psychotherapy, so it's very popular. But this is also this model does not take into consideration the clinical view of psychotherapy action. So from a clinical point of view, we can reach this model in several directions, and this is what I have done or I'm trying to do in my research. In this presentation, I will focus on few questions that are relevant for this aim. First, if controlled processes are specifically involved in adaptive emotion regulation. So this increasing executive function, using more controlled processes, or speaking more clinically, controlling more emotion, is something positive, or is every time positive or not? The second question is, controlled processes and executive function and prefrontal areas activation is necessary for emotion regulation? And finally, this kind of dual process model is confirmed by the empirical evidence on psychotherapy. So starting from the first question, I focus on the adaptiveness of emotion regulation. So as I said before, reappraisal is the most investigated form of emotion regulation and is considered adaptive. So in general, we can say that reappraisal is adaptive, but several forms of cognitive control are not so adaptive. An example is the paradoxical effect of cognitive control. For example, if I ask you to do not think to a white bear, everybody is now thinking to a white bear, because this is a paradoxical effect of our mind, because two processes are, it includes two processes. On one hand, we are trying to control a cognitive content, a mental content. On the other hand, we are checking if the content is present or not. This kind of paradoxical effect of cognitive control is involved and is important for several forms of clinical symptoms. For example, rumination of unwanted thoughts is an example of a paradoxical effect of mental control, or the intrusion of traumatic memories in post-traumatic stress disorders. The obsessive compulsive disorder is, of course, is a form of paradoxical effect of control. So we can, from a clinical point of view, we can affirm that controlling mental content or control emotion is not every time something positive. Looking at the brain level, this is a review of this kind of study. In this figure here, you can see the areas that are in green, that are areas of the executive system of the brain. As I said before, reappraisal involves these areas, so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and the reappraisal is when individuals carry out a reappraisal task, have activation in these areas. However, also the suppression, which is considered maladaptive, is located in the same areas. So what we can say, observing the data, is that the executive areas, that both positive and negative forms of emotional control are located in executive areas. And several authors have tried to propose interpretation of this result. For example, somebody says that the temporal dynamics may change, or the laterality can be a little bit different. But anyway, both kind of emotion regulation forms involve the executive areas. So we can say that activated more the prefrontal cortex is not something that can be only positive. It can be also negative. For example, in suppression is something negative. And more in general, we know also that, for example, depressed patients activated more these areas when ruminate, for example. So the cognitive control can be maladaptive, and activating prefrontal areas is not a synonymous of adaptiveness. The second aspect is the necessary, if controlled processes are necessary for emotion regulation. In the clinical literature, we have several examples of non-voluntary emotion regulation. An example is the concept of defense mechanisms. The defense mechanisms are example or forms of emotion regulation. The individuals use defense mechanisms to decrease anxiety or other emotions, but without a voluntary attempt to do it. But also in social psychology, for example, the concept of automatic emotion regulation is used to describe situations in which individuals, for example, express less emotion in order to in line with the social norms, for example. In the case of neuroimaging, it's very hard to study automatic emotion regulation because, for definition, it's impossible to give the instruction to spontaneously regulate. But there are few, the scholars are creative, and there are few attempts in few experimental design that can be used with this attempt. One very used is the use of distractors. So individuals are carrying out a main task, and during these tasks they are presented with emotional distractors, and they have to avoid these distractions in order to carry out the task, or spontaneous avoidance, as in this study. I have also collaborated with this study, and in this study individuals were exposed to a picture before, and then they were exposed to several versions of a description of this picture. Sometimes the pictures was described with emotional content, sometimes was described with neutral content. After the fMRI task, individuals were invited to describe, to report what they remembered about the picture. So the picture were presented again. Individuals were invited to report what they remembered about the picture. We used the number of emotional words that they used to describe the picture as an index of spontaneous avoidance, because somebody reported more emotional content, somebody else reported more neutral content, and this was a measure. We used this individual difference as a measure of spontaneous avoidance or not avoidance of emotional content. This kind of spontaneous avoidance modulated areas of the brain that were not located in executive areas of the brain, but they were located medially in the brain, both in the anterior part of the brain, so the anterior cingulate, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but also posteriorly in the precuneus, posterior cingulate precuneus. And so we observed that the location was not in the areas that usually are reported for emotion regulation, not executive areas. And also such kind of activation were modulations of areas that are deactivated during the task. So we observed another kind of result. So this is very important to understand the nature of such areas that we found here, but that now I will report also in other research. These areas, the areas that we found in the study of spontaneous regulation were here and here. These are part of the default mode network. The default mode network is a set of areas which are usually deactivated during a task. So the first time that this kind of areas have been described, they were described because scholars observed that when the individual is carrying out a traditional neuroimaging task, for example, a working memory task, such areas of the brain are deactivated. So this means that they are not simply turned off, but they have a function that is carried out through the activation. And this is very interesting from a theoretical point of view. So what are the functions of these areas? First of all, it's interesting to say that they are anti-correlated to the executive areas that we have described before in association to traditional reappraisal of voluntary emotion regulation. So when the individual is carrying out a voluntary action, these areas are deactivated. Instead, when the individual is at rest, so when the mind is free to wander, these areas are active and the executive areas instead are deactivated. These areas are active when the individual, when the attention is to internal sources. So, for example, when we are concentrated on our emotional states, or when we are perceiving somatic sensations, such areas are activated. Moreover, such areas are activated in self-projection. There are a lot of functions that involve self-projection, for example, empathy, theory of mind, our way to project ourselves in the point of view of others. But also, for example, when we image ourselves in the future, in future plans, or when we think to autobiographical memories, we are projecting ourselves. So the default network is activated in a lot of functions that are very relevant from a clinical point of view. All this function can be also considered semantic processes. In this review that I'm using here, the researcher have collected a lot of studies on semantic processes, and they found that such studies are activate areas of the brain that coincide the most with the default mode network. So in my research, I have been focused on such kind of semantic processes. In a broad meaning, semantic refers to the attributes of representations that arise from generalizing regularities of experiences. So are generalization of our experiences. And we use such generalization to create expectation about the future. So as you can imagine, this is very important from a clinical point of view. This is very close to the notion of schema. The schemas are semantic representations, and in psychotherapy, especially we are interested on semantic representations that concern the self, the relationships, social interactions. And we know that such kind of schemas are very important motivational and affective consequences. So going back to the spontaneous emotion regulation, we, as I said before, we can observe that emotion regulation is located, spontaneous emotion regulation is located in the default system, so implicate these semantic areas, both in the medial part of the brain, but also in these lateral parts in blue here are also part of the default system. But also the traditional forms of emotion regulation involve the default system. So the default system is implicated in both spontaneous and voluntary emotion regulation, whereas the attentional system is involved exclusively in the case of voluntary emotion regulation. This is another example of this kind of result. In this is a meta-analysis in which we compared two kinds of reappraisal. Reappraisal of stimuli, that is a more traditional form of reappraisal in which the individuals are instructed to change the meaning of the stimuli, and reappraisal via perspective taking, in which the individuals is instructed to change the perspective on an event. And in the case of reappraisal via perspective taking, we also observed that the executive areas are not so relevant, but the semantic areas are relevant for both kinds of reappraisal. So in summary, we have evidence that the semantic areas of the brain are strongly involved in emotion regulation, even if most popular models emphasize the role of executive function. The role of semantic function is at least important as the role of executive functions. Another interesting example is the case of emotional acceptance. Emotional acceptance is a sense of curiosity about emotions, non-judgmental attitude towards ongoing experiences without trying to control, change, suppress, or avoid them. So most psychotherapists have an idea of what acceptance is. And most psychotherapy now that acceptance can be considered something that is the opposite of controlling emotions. We know that acceptance is adaptive as a form of emotion regulation. For example, is effective in dismissing emotional reactivity and physiological arousal in response to aversive emotion, is related to the perception of stress, and is related to better health outcomes. So we have strong evidence that acceptance is a very positive strategy to regulate emotions. Moreover, acceptance is also a common factor across psychotherapies. For example, the traditional humanistic experiential therapy recognize the role of acceptance, but all the third wave psychotherapies recognize and give an important role to acceptance, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and cognitive therapy, emotion-focused therapy. Also the mindfulness, all mindfulness-based approaches are related to acceptance, and also more recent models of dynamic therapy recognize the importance of acceptance. In this meta-analysis, I summarized with a meta-analytic method to summarize neuroimaging data all the results of studies that have investigated the neural correlates of acceptance. And we found with my group is that acceptance involves these areas of the brain, that is the posterior cingulate precuneus, which again is a core part of the default mode network that I have described before. So this is very interesting because, first of all, as you can see in these results, acceptance does not involve significantly executive areas of the brain. Sometimes some studies reported also the involvement of executive areas, but not in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that typically is reported in reappraisal studies. And anyway, this kind of result resulted not significant at the meta-analytic level. So we observed that in the case of acceptance, executive areas are not necessary. They are not involved in this kind of processes. And instead, the semantic areas of the brain are more relevant. And again, this kind of activity was in the negative direction. So the precuneus, I choose here this kind of color because these areas were less activated during acceptance. So when individuals carry out an acceptance task, these areas of the brain are more deactivated. Then we also directly compared the reappraisal and acceptance. Of course, we found that reappraisal, we confirmed the involvement of executive areas in reappraisal, but not in acceptance. Then we also observed that even if most models of emotion regulation emphasize the role of executive areas of controlled processes, voluntary processes, even if the involvement of executive areas is very strongly emphasized, there are several studies that recognize the role of the posterior posterior cingulate or precuneus, which is the areas that I have shown, this area here. And this area is involved in a lot of forms of regulation, such as self-distancing and self-destructions, the avoidance of aversive stimuli, and again in spontaneous avoidance. So in studies that have investigated forms of regulation that are the opposite of acceptance, or avoidance, or self-distancing, the posterior precuneus was more activated. So the idea is that when individuals try to be distant, to avoid stimuli even spontaneously, this area is more activated. Instead, with the acceptance is deactivated. So our interpretation of this result was that in acceptance, such kind of deactivation as the function of inhibition of internal semantic representation. So I have done an example here. An example of, clinically speaking, an example of a schema can be, I am a bad person, for example. If a person activates a cognitive schema that is, I am a bad person, the consequence is a negative emotion. The idea is that the activation or deactivation of the precuneus has the effect of activation or inhibition of this kind of schema. So the idea is that emotion regulation at this level might act modulating emotional processing through the recruitment or schematic representations. So this kind is not just control or not, but is schemas that are activated or not. Finally, which neural systems are involved in psychotherapy action, and so which kind of psychological processes? This is a meta-analysis that I have realized a few years now. I am realizing that is 10 years ago. Is a meta-analysis of neuroimaging studies of psychotherapy of anxiety and depression disorders. And in this meta-analysis, what we found is that we observed changes in executive areas of the brain. But we considered two kinds of studies. We consider studies with the resting state and studies with the task-related activity in which individuals were exposed to emotional stimuli. First of all, we observed that both kinds of studies involved prefrontal areas of the brain. So we observed the involvement of executive areas. But this kind of involvement, first of all, was not situated in the typical executive areas of reappraisal, which are the dorsolateral cortex here, but were situated more medially. But the most interesting fact is that the direction was opposite in the two categories of studies, and this is a very important information, because it's not just to say that one area works better or is not working, but the important thing is if the activation of these areas is important and is required in that moment. So we observed that after psychotherapy, in resting state, prefrontal areas were less deactivated, but were more activated when the individuals had to respond to emotional stimuli. So the idea is that after psychotherapy, brain functioning was more has a better balance, and the brain is active when it has to respond to emotional stimuli, but also can rest when emotional stimuli are not present. Then we also found the involvement of other areas of the brain. I have also other picture, which are located more medially in the precuneus again, but also in temporal areas that are also part of the default system or default mode network. So we observed that at least both processes should be considered. We have to consider executive function, but we also have to consider semantic functions, and that the direction is not so clear, because executive areas can be more activated because individuals ruminate more or think too much. In order to use a very simple expression, but also they can use less prefrontal areas to regulate their emotions. So it's also important to understand when such kind of areas and processes are used by the individuals. This is just a summary of such results with using the pictures that I have shown before. So as you can see here, we have the involvement of the voluntary attentional system, executive areas, but also of semantic areas and of the brain. Also, such kind of activity in the temporal parietal junction, angular gyrus, I have no time to speak about this, but are very important for social representations. So for semantic representation that concern relationship with others, or also they are more importantly involved in theory of mind, empathy, so are very relevant from the clinical point of view. So again, to summarize, executive processes, with regard to executive processes, neural effects of psychotherapy are not exclusively located in executive areas, and the direction of the change can be compatible both with an increase or decrease of executive control. And the semantic process should be also considered in clinical models of psychotherapy action. From a clinical point of view, we can observe that also we can also discuss this kind of model from a clinical point of view. If we consider the executive processes, we know that some traditional conceptualization of psychotherapy can be in line with the idea of controlling emotion as something that is important in psychotherapy. For example, in traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, using reappraisal or control emotion can be sometimes something that is part of the theoretical model. But in many other therapies, controlling emotion is considered something negative. For example, in the case of expressive therapy, controlling emotion is not considered positive, but also in all acceptance-based therapy, as I said before, controlling avoid emotion is considered something not positive. Instead, the role of semantic processes is very consistent with clinical models of psychotherapy action, because most psychotherapy theories concern semantic representation of the self, past experiences, interpersonal situation, including the therapeutic relationship. So when the therapeutic dyad speak about the therapeutic relationship, they are constructing semantic representation of relationships. I have few examples here. In the case of exposure techniques, changing memory representation means changing the association between stimulus and responses in our mental schemas. In cognitive therapy, of course, the idea of schema is an idea that comes from the cognitive therapy. But also in psychodynamic approaches, interpretation is an exercise of signification. When the therapist and the patient interpret, they give new meanings to their experience, feelings, or bodily sensations. Then this is very present in the case of borderline psychotherapy. Most recent therapies, borderline therapies are very focused and emphasize very much the role of semantic processes. For example, in the dialectical behavioral therapy, moving from polarized representation to dialectical thinking is an example of working on semantic representation, because is going beyond the black and white and construct more sophisticated representation of the self, of the others, of the experiences. Also in transference focused psychotherapy, work on the therapeutic relationship is a way to construct more integrated representations, semantic representation of significant others. Or in mentalization therapy, semantic representation concern the meta-emotion and metacognition. So we can say that work on semantic representation is the core of most psychotherapy models. And it is nice to observe that the neuroimaging data are in line with this idea. I just show here a few other examples of neuroimaging studies of psychotherapy, in this case that are focused on borderline psychotherapy, because as I said before, borderline psychotherapy are even more focused on semantic work. And here, as you can see, we have again, we found, these are not my studies, Perez et al. Found significant change in brain activity that were located in the anterior cingulate cortex and again posterior cingulate cortex precuneus, so the same area of the default system that I described before. Or this is another example. The first example comes from a study on transference focused psychotherapy. The second example instead regards dialectical behavioral therapy, but in both cases we can observe similar results, and the location is the default system, whereas this kind of therapy involves even less executive areas of the brain. So if in the case of cognitive behavioral therapy with anxiety and depression, we found changes at the level of executive areas, here this kind of therapy works even more only on semantic representation more than in control. This is another interesting study that demonstrated also the change in brain structures, not only function, but also structures. And again, the locations here are situated in the anterior cingulate, angular gyrus that I mentioned before, but also here in the posterior precuneus. So we can affirm that the semantic areas of the brain are very relevant for psychotherapy, and this idea is very strongly in line with clinical models of psychotherapy. So if most popular models that yes, the fact is that in neuroimaging, in affective neuroscience, dual process models and models based on voluntary forms of emotion regulation are very popular and very used, and most of the studies that concern psychotherapy, psychopathology are based and are interpreted using this kind of model. But if we look at the data, we observe that also other processes can be relevant, and from a clinical point of view, this is very interesting and very important. So it's very important that clinical psychologists may contribute to the interpretation of the data, giving more emphasis on other functions that are also relevant. This is just a very new papers that I have read today, just to, not today, but in these days, and that I have added to this presentation, that describe in a very perfect way what I mean when I try to describe the function of the default system, and when I talk about semantic processes. Here they describe the default mode network as a sense-making network, and this definition of sense-making network sounds very nice also in a clinical from a clinical point of view, and they affirm that the neural responses in the default mode network are influenced both by internal informations that are accumulated over time, and when the individual is exposed to new stimuli, these are integrated with past memories, with past experiences, and the default mode network is the core of this kind of integration. So we can observe that this is something very important to understand and to study also for understanding psychotherapy action. And this is just to conclude that when we talk about semantic representation and when we talk about schemas, we are not talking about something that is in the field of cold cognition, but we are talking about a form of hot cognition. So the schemas are not just cognitive representations, but they are cognitive representation, but integrated with somatic states, emotions, and is in neuroimaging investigation account for this kind of description, because especially the role of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or anterior cingulate are associated with the anterior cingulate more in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex are associated with the integration between cognition and somatic states. This is also very important because also the studies on subjective value, when individuals are exposed to emotional stimuli, they give a subjective value to this stimuli, and such subjective value are related to their bodily sensation or emotional reaction. So is from a psychotherapeutic point of view, is important the possibility to change such subjective values, working on the awareness of bodily sensation, feelings. So it's not just working on cognitive schemas, but it's also a work that is more complex and involves the connection with the bodily sensation and emotions, and the neural correlates that we have observed in psychotherapy are in line with this kind of interpretation. So this is just to summarize my point of view. So we started from a dual process model. So we used this kind of thermometer to describe emotion regulation as something that help in decreasing emotion. So emotion is something, let's say, negative, and regulation helps in decreasing emotions. Instead, this can be a representation of semantic models. So When I have clear, sophisticated semantic representations, I can interpret well my experience, and I can translate my experience in giving responses that are adaptive to my experience. Instead, if the semantic representation are not clear, are rigid, the individual has a reaction that are the same, are not, how to say, personalized, are not specific for the situation, and the response is just black or white. So working on semantic model is this kind of work, is helping the individuals to better represent how relationship works, better represent the self, has even more complex representations of the self, or with all the components of the self that are not only cognitive but also somatic, emotional, and so on. Okay, these are a few references that I want to give you. Today I tried to summarize the results of the studies that you see in these references, or the most important are here. And well, this is all. Thank you for your attention. I hope that there are questions.
Thank you so much, Irene. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you, Miguel.
Time for questions. Perhaps I can start.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
My name is Gert Keizers. Thank you very, very much for this really lovely presentation. My question is this. In the last part, you mentioned that semantic representation is very much also about emotions, about body and the experience of things. But on the other hand, psychotherapy is talking. So couldn't you argue it's also very much about language without all the body things?
Well, the semantic representation are related to language, of course, because when semantic representation are based on narratives. But of course, this is related also to semantic sensation, because especially the ventromedial prefrontal cortex has specifically this role connecting semantic representation, words, let's say words or narratives, with bodily sensations and emotions. So of course, these are connected. But I'm not sure that this was the question.
I do think that this is an answer for the question, because you can do cognitive therapy, for example, by logical meanings, and then you might not activate these areas you are talking about, because it's only about words and symbolic meaning.
Yes. Okay. Well, there is a difference in the default mode network, for example. Let's say purely cognitive processes activate more the lateral part of the brain, that are areas in which the semantic store are accumulated. So we have semantic representation that can be only cognitive and involve just temporal areas of the brain. So these are purely cognitive. But when we go to the medial parts of the brain, semantic processes are not just cognitive representation, but they involve also somatic sensations and feelings. So when these areas are activated, the individual, for example, remember a bodily sensation, remember an emotional state. And sometimes this can be also connected to a narrative, sometimes not, but this is the role of psychotherapy, is improve the communication between these areas that are related to emotional activations, related also to past experience and so on, and pure cognitive representations.
Okay, thank you very much, very clear.
Other questions? I have a question, Irene. Do you think that neuroscience will solve the problem of the dodo bird verdict?
Well, in my opinion, observing the data is not an opinion. All the therapies have very similar effects at the brain level. for this reason, I am also interested on integrating psychotherapies, because observing the data, there are not differences. A few studies also tried to compare, for example, cognitive behavioral and dynamic therapy. There are not a lot of studies. There is a meta-analysis that tried to compare different models, but the differences are not relevant. And if present, that can be attributed more to the experimental task than to the therapy.
And between psychotherapy and antidepressive medication, are there any differences?
Yes, in this case, the differences are present. The idea is that medicaments act more on the limbic system, so on emotional areas, on emotional reaction, but not on both executive or semantic areas.
Okay.
Maybe they can involve sometimes also as part of the anterior cingulate, because it's connected also with pain perception, for example, both psychological pain and physical pain, but not other brain areas of the brain are more related to emotional reaction. The idea is that, for example, antidepressant modulate more the emotional reaction, whereas psychotherapy involves more semantic representations or areas involved in cognitive control sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Of course, this is also an interpretation, because when researchers publish a study on antidepressant, for example, the interpretation is more related to concepts that are not from psychotherapy, so they do not interpret their data using psychological processes to explain the results. They maybe use other kind of concept, but it will be interesting also to use our view to interpret such kind of data.
Mm-hmm. We have some time for questions. If you have other questions, you can write on the chat if you prefer. I can ask another if there are any questions. Sorry. Would you say that using this data, we can confirm that psychotherapy is a job of changing meaning-making processes and
change
meaning-making processes?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
This is exactly what
the data suggests.
my opinion. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is not the main interpretation that you will find if you read a paper in the field of affective neuroscience, because most of the time the data are interpreted using more popular models that comes from the neuroscientific tradition, not from the clinical tradition. But this is the interesting part of my job, because coming from a clinical background, I have the possibility to use new concepts that are not usually considered by neuroscientists.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I was wondering about this, if there are studies, for instance, just with behavioral methods like exposure therapy or behavioral activation that shows exactly the same path of change.
Well, in my meta-analysis, I also I also added an explorative part specific for exposure therapies, because they were very homogeneous. The studies were very homogeneous, so I explored also the specific effect of these exposure therapies, but the results were also similar.
Interesting.
The involvement of prefrontal areas was even less important. and the effect on subcortical areas was more evident, because also for the homogeneity of the studies. I didn't talk a lot about the subcortical results of psychotherapy, because most studies of psychotherapy report the decreased activation of the amygdala, but this is something that I consider obvious. But it can be achieved with a lot of therapies, and is more a thing that therapy has an effect on emotional activation, but it's not interesting to understand which kind of process is active in promoting such kind of change.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question, or our time is up also? But if you have... Okay. Irene, thank you so much once again for this interesting presentation. I would like to announce that our last webinar of this series will take place in the 22nd of March at the same time. And the title is Towards Personalized Psychotherapy, the Importance of the Trait-like, State-like Distinction for Understanding Therapeutic Change. And our presenter will be Sigil Zishalmano from Israel. So you are all invited to come. Hope to see you soon. Thank you very much for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Irene. Thank you so much.
See you in Dublin.
Bye-bye. See you all. Bye-bye.